Congratulations, you are home.
What's inside is extremely controversial.
Yeah, you can see just how much coronavirus is affecting the drug trade here in Mexico.
Could plunge Northern Ireland back into violent conflict.
They control everything here, even what the Palestinians do in their villages with their money.
I don't see how we can be at peace if we don't agree on the basic facts of what's true and what's false.
Foreign Correspondent, coming to Thursdays on ABC TV and streaming on iView.
The federal government under pressure to do more to convince hesitant Australians to get vaccinated against coronavirus.
There's around 65% of the population who's very happy to go on the vaccine. So right now the focus is ensuring that those who are very happy to go and do it, go and do it.
The government hails its pandemic response. The unemployment figure continues to fall despite the loss of 30,000 jobs. Qantas freezes wages and offers redundancies as it grapples with the possibility of another year of border closures. And Israel vows to continue strikes on Gaza despite calls for calm from the United States. Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. Doctors are pushing for a better advertising and awareness strategy to convince more people to get their COVID-19 vaccination. They warn Australians are sitting ducks and say they're increasingly alarmed by the number of people hesitant or waiting to get their jabs. Political reporter James Glendo joins me now from Canberra. James, how does Australia's advertising campaign compare to the rest of the world?
Good evening, Karina. I think it's a really interesting question because we see in the United Kingdom there are celebrities endorsing the COVID-19 vaccine, encouraging people to go and get it and even getting it on camera. In Singapore, we've got a lovely pop group, which if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you YouTube it to take a look. It'll certainly stick in your mind. Whereas in Australia, we've got the very charming Dr. Nick Coatsworth, who was the former National Deputy Medical Officer. He played a big role in last year's initial pandemic response, appeared a lot on camera, and he's urging people to get the jab. But there are doctors who don't think that those advertisements are running enough. They don't think enough people are seeing it. And they also worry about vaccine hesitancy. In particular, they worry people over the age of 50 who are slated to get the AstraZeneca vaccine may be hesitant to get it because of the very, very small chance of blood clots. For example, we know that about 24 people have formed those clots so far that are thought to be related to the vaccine out of about 2.1 million doses. So it's a very, very small chance. Overall, the Prime Minister has rejected the criticism of the advertising and communications program today. He says that he thinks things are going well and that the number of people getting vaccinated will continue to ramp up. Here's a little of what Mr Morrison had to say earlier today.
40 million that the government is investing both this year and next year in the communications campaign. But I'd make this point to you. There's around 65% of the population who's very happy to go on the vaccine. So right now the focus is ensuring that those who are very happy to go and do it, go and do it. And there's plenty of opportunity for them to do that if they're over the 50 at present, and that's why we just simply encourage those who already are happy to go and have that vaccine to go and get that vaccine.
That's the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. So, James, what does the opposition make of how the government has handled the program?
Well, the opposition is very critical of the way the government has handled the rollout of the vaccine so far. It's been critical of the way some targets have been missed. Interestingly, we're hearing from businesses, we are hearing from airlines, we're hearing from politicians as well, who are all calling for some sort of roadmap out of COVID-19. And by that, they mean set dates for when things are going to happen. So, or set targets in terms of the number of people or percentage of the population vaccinated. And they argue that for example, if everyone knew that things were going to start reopening in March next year and that borders would open and that COVID-19 would come back into Australia, they'd argue that'd be a pretty good incentive for a lot of people to get the jab. And so I think that is kind of an interesting discussion that a lot of people are starting to push for, because they say that that could help reduce some of the hesitancy we're seeing, particularly around AstraZeneca and then maybe later on other vaccines as well. The Labor spokesman Mark Butler was out and about talking about this today. He said that the government should also be looking at certain incentives to try to encourage people to get vaccinated. Here's a little of what he had to say.
At the end of the day, we need to think carefully about the substance of the advertising, but clearly what other countries like New Zealand are relying upon is the incentive to get vaccinated. The fact that the pathway to freedom, as New Zealand calls it, lies in the path of vaccination.
I think it's interesting, Karina, to think about what sort of incentive might encourage people to actually get vaccinated. Is it overseas travel? Is it the idea that even if there was an outbreak in a certain state, they'd still be able to cross borders? Lots of different people are incentivised by different things, so it'll be an interesting one to watch to see where the government lands on that, and indeed if they do update their strategy in the next couple of weeks.
Indeed, it will be interesting to watch and see. James Glenday reporting there from Canberra. Shortly, we'll be speaking to the man who devised a marketing campaign to try to slow the spread of HIV/AIDS. He says emotionally driven messaging is needed to get people to take notice and change behaviour. That's coming up, so stay with us. 30,000 people lost work in April after the government's JobKeeper wage subsidy scheme came to an end, while 33,000 full-time jobs were gained last month. More than 64,000 part-time jobs were lost. Despite this, the unemployment rate has fallen from 5.7 to 5.5%, and employment remains slightly higher than before the pandemic. The participation rate is down slightly from a record high 66.3% in March to 66% in April. And despite the loss of JobKeeper, youth unemployment has fallen to its lowest level since the global financial crisis. The Treasurer says today's figures reaffirm the government's economic response to the coronavirus pandemic. Labor has welcomed the figures but says there's more work to be done to ensure Australians have secure, well-paying jobs.
The Labor Party said that the sky would fall in with the end of JobKeeper. The Labor Party will be very disappointed with today's job numbers because they've been talking down the Australian economy for the full 15 months of this pandemic.
It's all about jobs and jobs that pay well. You know, the real question is whether or not, as people consider their vote at the next election, they're in a better position now than they were 8 years ago. We've had record low wage growth, and that speaks to an economy which is not delivering for the Australian people.
Ernst & Young Chief Economist Joe Masters says today's figures are encouraging despite the loss of part-time positions.
I think there's a lot of volatility in the data. We saw last month that all the employment growth was part-time, so there might just be a little bit of juggling around month to month. It is encouraging, though, when the job growth that we see is full-time. As you said, it can indicate that firms are more confident about their future. It may also be that those people that have been on JobKeeper and have lost their job had already moved from full-time to part-time positions, and now the part-time position has disappeared. So you've got that loss of jobs in part-time.
Qantas has announced a 2-year wage freeze for staff. Boss Alan Joy says the company expects to lose $16 billion in revenue because of the coronavirus pandemic. The airline is also offering voluntary redundancies, which are expected to be taken up by hundreds of workers, especially international cabin crew.
We expect to post a statutory loss before tax of more than $2 billion in financial year 21. That's on top of the $2.7 billion of losses last year. We also know that the pandemic will have cost us at least $16 billion since the start of 2020 in lost revenue by the end of this financial year. I think it's safe to say there's no other company in Australia that's had a bigger impact from COVID than the Qantas Group.
Advocates say reforming the NDIS to make independent assessments mandatory will be detrimental to people living with disability. A parliamentary committee is investigating the proposal, which would see participants assessed with personal questions and requests to complete certain tasks. The Minister in charge of the NDIS, Linda Reynolds, has told the committee the scheme is too reliant on the natural empathy of public servants. Speaking to afternoon briefing host Patricia Karvelis, the former Minister in charge, Stuart Robert, defended her comments.
Independence estimates are all about getting equity in the system. If you're in the seat of Boothby, your average plan is $95,000. If you're in the seat of Macon, it's $65,000. If you're poor in the NDIS right now, you are not getting as good a package as if you are wealthy, and that is wrong.
Okay.
It's wrong in principle and it's wrong in fact.
Do you agree with the new Minister, Linda Reynolds, that there's just too much empathy from bureaucrats?
The Productivity Commission again recommended independent assessments.
But I asked you a question.
To deal with
Is there
the
too much
perception,
empathy,
to deal with a perception of empathy bias.
What's
and that's
empathy
what the Productivity
bias?
Commission said. It says that treating physicians of individuals have a great heart for the people with disability they're serving, and that may lead to bias. Now, these are the Productivity Commission's words, not mine.
Okay, but these are people who are incredibly vulnerable. Why take the risk of replicating the errors of robo-debt, which your government is now paying for?
Patricia, it's got nothing to do with robo-debt.
Well, Bruce Bonnehady says it's the same mistake.
It's rubbish.
So what?
You know it's rubbish.
You think Bruce Bonnehady is wrong?
It's rubbish. We use independent assessments right now for the disability support pension. We use it right now for aged care assessment teams, ACAT assessments. This is simply using it in disability, and no one saying the DSP or ACAT is linked to income compliance.
Big business in Victoria will be slugged by tax increases to help pay for billions in funding for mental health services as Victoria's Treasurer hands down another big spending state budget. Reporter Leanne Wong has more.
One of the biggest winners will be the state's health system, with almost $2.2 billion set aside for hospitals as well as ambulance services, and another $3.8 billion for Victoria's struggling mental health system. Now, in order to pay for the billions of dollars in funding for mental health, big business will be forced to foot the bill, namely in the form of a mental health and wellbeing levy. From next year, businesses that pay more than $10 million in wages will be hit by a 0.5% surcharge to payroll tax, which is estimated to affect about 5% of businesses. Now, this levy was one of 65 recommendations that came out in the Royal Commission that found that Victoria's mental health system had catastrophically failed and needed to be completely reset. Here's what Treasurer Tim Pallas had to say.
But it is not only appropriate but fair that big business make a substantial contribution. Essentially, it's a 0.5% increase for those businesses over $10 million in terms of national payroll, and a further 0.5% increase for those businesses that have payrolls over $100 million nationally. You only pay above that threshold, and you only pay for that section of your workforce that are employed in Victoria. But it's about recognising that there is still and there will be enduring issues that will need to be dealt with as a consequence of the pandemic event.
Now, one of the biggest losers, aside from big business, will be property investors due to an increase to land tax for properties worth more than $1.8 million, as well as the introduction of a premium stamp duty for property transactions above $2 million. Now, that wasn't a surprise. The government had announced it over the weekend, but it has already received pushback from property groups. Now, overall, the tone of this speech that Treasurer Tim Pallas gave today was one of optimism, and he said that Victoria is on the road to recovery, which is quite a contrast to the budget he handed down just 6 months ago, where the focus was mainly on just getting the state through the pandemic. Overall, the economic picture for the state is also looking much better, with the final deficit for the 2020 to 2021 budget falling at $6 billion less than originally predicted. The state is expected to remain in deficit in the coming years. The budget also predicts quite optimistically that the state can expect a return to the number of tourists, migrants and international students from as early as next year. And Treasurer Tim Pallas says that he's confident that Victoria will soon be welcoming more people into its borders than more people are leaving relatively soon.
Well, still to come on ABC News this evening, we'll be talking to someone about that particular story, more funding for mental health in the Victorian state budget, with that money coming from an unusual source. Let's return to our top story this hour. Australia's advertising has largely consisted of health professionals encouraging people to get vaccinated. Not every country has taken the same approach. Let's take a look at how a few other campaigns have worked around the world.
We're going to have the vaccine now, Elton, so just kind of pretend that you're having the vaccine from a nurse.
Oh!
What was that, Elton?
That was me acting.
OK, let's cut there.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Michael Caine. I've just had a vaccine for COVID. It didn't hurt. Not many people know that.
We're overfighting and we're ready to win. Watch out.
Because you know what this is? It's the metaphorical door to freedom.
Some say late, some say loud. Guess who's back? It's Uncle Bob.
And me, Rosie.
Everybody, it's time to vaccinate. Faster, Lola. No time to waste.
But you are easy, confirm say.
Yeah, Rosie, come on, be brave.
Well, to discuss what Australia can learn from these countries and ad campaigns of the past, I'm joined by Simon Reynolds, who devised the Grim Reaper advertisement during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. He joins me now in the studio. Simon Reynolds, thanks so much for being here. What do you make of some of the ads that you've seen from overseas?
Well, I think they do half the job, which is they're impactful, and I think that's great. The problem is the people who don't want to get the vaccination, and they're going to watch that and do nothing, in my opinion.
OK, so what do you make of Australia's efforts so far in encouraging people to get the vaccine?
Well, I think they're all about information. It's available, it's safe, etc., etc., etc. But it's not about persuasion. And our biggest risk is some say 30% of Australians who don't want to get the vaccine. We need something harder, we need something stronger, we need something more direct.
OK, we'll talk about solutions in a moment, but let's take a look before that at the ad that had such an impact in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic. And this is your commercial. Let's take a look at it now.
That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead. That if not stopped, it could kill more Australians than World War II. But AIDS can be stopped, and you can help stop it. If you have sex, have just one sex.
So that ad used fear. Why was it so effective?
Well, I think because it woke people up. You know, there's some similarities between the vaccination situation and the AIDS situation back then. The typical person did not think they were in danger of getting AIDS, just like the typical person doesn't really in Australia think they're in much danger of getting COVID. So they'll look at all the information and then just ignore it.
So earlier this week, I spoke to Mike Toole, who's a medical epidemiologist with the Burnett Institute, and he categorised Australia's marketing advertising campaign so far as being rather boring and a bit dull. And he was saying that the biggest group that is vaccine hesitant is young women, and that maybe we need to be a bit more creative in terms of targeting them with using, say, Australia's female sports stars like Ash Barty and Sam Kerr. What do you think of that idea?
Sure, I think that could be strong in versus the current government campaign. You know, I think the current government campaign will fix an illness, but it's insomnia. It's just going to send people to sleep.
Okay, so what will work? What, if you had to come up with a strategy without giving it all away in case the contract does come your way, what would you do?
Well, we don't have to worry about 70% of Australians because they will eventually get the vaccine. For the 30%, we've got to remember that there's two reasons why they don't want to have a vaccine other than it's maybe slightly irritating to do it and time-consuming. The first is they think COVID's over. And the second thing is they think that they're not going to, if they get it, it's not going to be that bad. You know, it's going to be 2 weeks of flu and that's about it. We need to say to people, there's new strands coming. There's a real danger it could come back. And if it comes back, it could be 3 times, 5 times as bad. So be prepared.
So you're saying use fear again?
Well, use reality. There really could be strands coming and they really could be 3 times worse. But most people aren't thinking about that and they think the whole thing's over.
Do you think it doesn't just need to be television ads or newspaper ads, that we need to be thinking more broadly in terms of social media campaigns as well to hit those young people?
Oh, very much so. It has to be mostly social media with a top line, the icing on the cake being mainstream media. We also have to go deep into ethnic media so that we make an impact inside the community.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. How do you penetrate those multicultural communities when it comes to mainstream broad brush advertising?
Yeah, it's a great question. The trick is to do visual advertising. And all kinds of research has shown that many cultures will react the same way to strong visuals. If it's all about the words, it obviously gets lost in translation. But a strong visual campaign or someone famous, even in those cultures, can really make it work.
The Prime Minister comes from a marketing background. Have you been disappointed that he hasn't taken more of a lead here to say that we could be being a bit more creative?
Well, we don't know what's coming. He is an expert at marketing, and it could be that he has something more impactful up his sleeve. But he needs to do something soon, because the longer we don't advertise the potential dangers in not getting the vaccination, the bigger the problem becomes.
So if there was to be a rejigging of the campaign, how long would that take? Could it be done very quickly?
Oh, it could be done in weeks, and it should be done in weeks.
OK, Simon Reynolds, really appreciate you coming in and talking us through it.
My pleasure.
A New South Wales woman found guilty of the manslaughter of her mother has been spared jail. Barbara Eckersley has instead been sentenced to a 2-year community corrections order. Reporter Elizabeth Byrne has more.
Mary White became a celebrity scientist after her bestseller, The Greening of Gondwana, was published. But in her later years, she suffered dementia and strokes until she could no longer speak and was barely able to move. Her daughter, Barbara Eckersley, admitted putting the so-called green dream drugs in her food shortly before she died, but denied she intended to kill her. But Justice Robert Beach-Jones found that was her intent.
The only reasonable inference from that conduct, when engaged in by a person as intelligent and caring as Mrs. Eckersley, is that she intended to end her mother's suffering by ending her life.
But Justice Beach-Jones told the court her culpability was low because of her level of depression. He said he thought she'd convinced herself since her mother's death that she hadn't intended to kill her.
She is completely relieved and very grateful to be walking out today and finally finishing this court process.
As the court rose, Ms. Eckersley hugged family members and thanked her lawyers. The judge has also ordered she comply with a treatment order as part of her sentence.
A Tasmanian man has been found guilty of murdering his friend almost 3 years ago. Reporter Monica Champ has more from Launceston.
It took the jury 4.5 hours to unanimously find Jack Harrison Vincent Sadler guilty of murder. The 29-year-old fatally shot, beheaded and then dismembered his 24-year-old friend Jake Anderson Bretner over a drug debt in Launceston in August 2018. Sadler and his then fiancée Gemma Clark disposed of his body in wheelie bins around northern Tasmania. The court heard Sadler had a room in his home lined with plastic, set up for the killing. He'd arranged to meet with Mr Anderson Bretner to ease tensions over a 6-figure drug debt. Jurors heard Sadler and his victim had been friends since 2014 and had developed a drug dealing operation together. Sadler would get illicit drugs from Victorian suppliers he knew through working as a bouncer at a Launceston nightclub, and Mr Anderson Bretner would sell them around the city. But the court heard Mr Anderson Bretner racked up a more than $100,000 debt and Sadler was copping flack over it. The victim's family were in court as the guilty verdict was read out.
God, just really thankful to the DPP. They've done an amazing job. And the police, they've been wonderful too. But I'd like to say that, my son, he was priceless.
Sadler will return to court next Friday when he'll be sentenced.
Israel's Prime Minister has vowed to continue strikes on Gaza, where more than 200 people have been killed, including 64 children. Benjamin Netanyahu says he's determined to continue the offensive until its objective is achieved, while a senior Hamas official says he expects a ceasefire to be reached within days, even as cross-border attacks escalate. Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes on Gaza in the past day, which it says are targeting militant infrastructure. Close to 4,000 rockets have been fired at Israeli cities, hundreds of which have fallen short, with others intercepted by the Iron Dome.
You can either conquer them, and that's always an open possibility, or you can deter them. And we are engaged right now in forceful deterrence, but I have to say we don't rule out anything. We hope we can restore quiet. We hope we can restore it quickly.
Earlier, the US President Joe Biden urged Benjamin Netanyahu to seek a de-escalation in the 10-day conflict. That's despite the US mission saying it won't support a UN Security Council resolution on the matter. And tonight on the News Channel, we'll have a special program on the Israel-Gaza conflict hosted by Stan Grant. As calls grow for a ceasefire, we examine the reasons behind the cycle of violence. That's at 8 o'clock Eastern here on the ABC News Channel and anytime on ABC iView. Spain's government is urging regional authorities to accept hundreds of unaccompanied children and teenagers who swam or climbed into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta from Morocco. Around 8,000 migrants have arrived in Ceuta over the past 2 days, seeking a quick way into Europe. They included 1,500 minors like this teenager who braved the water crossing using empty plastic bottles to help keep him afloat. Other children, some as young as 7, have had to be plucked to safety by Spanish police divers. Around 2/3 of the migrants have now been sent back, but the children are being kept in crammed reception centres because it's illegal to deport minors in Spain. Health authorities in Malawi have destroyed nearly 20,000 expired doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine because they couldn't be used in time. The vials were part of a shipment of more than 100,000 doses that arrived in March with a use-by date of April, leaving less than 3 weeks for them to be used. The government managed to administer 80% of them but decided to destroy the rest. The health minister says it's important to build public confidence in the country's vaccine program.
A statement came from WHO which said, no, even if it was expired, we still could use it. But as a country, we had already made a decision that we're not going to use any expired vaccine.
The WHO has since reversed its position and now says vaccines beyond their expiration date should be destroyed. More than 6 months after closing its doors because of the pandemic, France's most famous museum, the Louvre, has reopened to visitors. It's the first stage of the government's plan to unwind COVID restrictions. The nightly curfew has been pushed back to 9 p.m, and bars, restaurants and cultural venues are back to partial capacity.
This morning it was a big emotion. We were nearly crying, but with the big smile, maybe a bigger smile than the Mona Lisa, to welcome visitors.
France's infection numbers are falling and more than 20 million people have had at least one COVID-19 vaccine dose. The government warns it could reverse the easing of restrictions if infections rise again. The New South Wales government has acquired 5,000 litres of a high-strength poison to help tackle the ongoing mouse plague. It comes with concerns the plague could reach Greater Sydney by August. Reporter Amelia Bernasconi has more from Tamworth in the state's northeast.
The state government says it secured enough of the chemical bromadiolone to last about 7 to 10 days. Now, the state's farmers have been grappling with this mouse plague for months now. Many have reported losses of crop and grain into the tens of thousands. Others have been forced to burn hay reserved for the next drought, and that can come up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The State Agriculture Minister has announced a $50 million package. As part of that, farmers will be able to have their grain treated for free at a number of sites to be set up across the state with that bromadiolone. The catch is the national regulator is yet to approve the use of bromadiolone. The state's agriculture minister says it's among the highest toxicity of mouse bait in the world that the state government could get their hands on. So until we have that approval from the regulator, it's sort of stalling a little bit as we continue to battle the mouse plague. The next question is from ecologists and even farmers themselves about secondary poisoning from bromadiolone to wildlife and as well as, farm animals and working dogs. So those questions will be answered. Of course, the APVMA, the regulator, will not be making approvals without doing its due diligence. So until then, we'll wait and see. The Agriculture Minister, though, says as soon as it's given the green light, they can move ahead with these treatment stations from the supply secured within Australia. There's also another few thousand litres on its way from overseas, so very confident the state's Agriculture Minister in securing that approval, getting this bromadiolone distributed to farmers and hopefully helping them combat this mouse plague.
Time for a check of the weather now. Here's Graham Creed.
There's a cold front moving up towards the southwest of Western Australia. It's really not going to have an impact until later in the day, and that will mostly be around the southwest Capes and along the coast of the south of the state through to around Albany. We've also got a burst of showers moving up the New South Wales coast. Now, that will actually make Sydney the only wet capital as we move into tomorrow, but even there, the potential of those showers reaching as far inland as the city remains relatively low. We'll still see some showers along the Queensland coast. That's due to a moist onshore wind flow. Much of the remainder of the continent will be clear, dry and sunny under the influence of a high-pressure system, but still plenty of frost across the southeast, particularly over the inland, with frost warnings out in Tasmania.
Here are the top stories on ABC News. The Prime Minister is urging anyone over the age of 70 to get the coronavirus vaccine. Doctors say some people are hesitant to get the AstraZeneca shot, but medical authorities insist the benefits of immunisation outweigh the risks. Scott Morrison says elderly Australians should talk to their doctor if they have any concerns. The unemployment rate has fallen despite more than 30,000 people losing work after the JobKeeper wage subsidy wrapped up, while full-time employment rose by 33,000 positions. Part-time work fell by 64,000. Youth unemployment is now a full percentage point below pre-pandemic levels. The Flight Attendants Association of Australia is questioning a decision by Qantas to seek further redundancies in the face of another multi-billion-dollar loss for the airline. The carrier is forecasting a before-tax loss of more than $2 billion for the financial year and says staff will also face a 2-year pay freeze. And despite talk of a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, attacks have continued on both sides. More than 100 airstrikes have been reported in Gaza, and Palestinian security officials say there's been extensive damage. The US president is calling for a significant de-escalation, but Israel's Prime Minister has vowed to continue until his objective is achieved. Victoria's government has handed down its budget and it promises to spend big on mental health. Big businesses will be hit with a levy to raise $843 million for mental health and wellbeing services each year. To discuss this, we're joined now by Betty Chikuti, a psychologist and director of the Australian Association of Psychologists. Thank you so much for your time. What do you make of this proposal?
Good evening, Karina. Look, we're really positive about Victoria taking the lead in terms of further supporting mental health, but we'd really like to have a lot more detail around the role of, additional support for psychologists so that they can maintain their access for their clients.
How desperately is this money needed?
It's beyond desperate. We've been talking about it for a good while. It's really unfortunate that we're not all quite on the same page. We have clients who, they're on waiting lists for up to 18 months. It's unacceptable. You don't need to be sick enough or suicidal enough. We're really tired of hearing these stories. We are, as professionals, also really tired of seeing the government talking about supporting mental health and supporting hubs, but we're really needing the money to go to psychologists who are seeing their clients right now and to be able to, give them more rebates so that they can continue their access. I have clients who've finished their 20 sessions and I'm really kind of wondering what the government expects me to do with those clients. Is that something that they're expecting psychologists to continue funding on their own back, or is it something that the government can follow some of the initiatives from the Productivity Commission, which was to have for up to 40 sessions. Now 40 sessions hasn't been talked about, telehealth hasn't been talked about, and the increased rebate hasn't been talked about. So it's kind of concerning. It's beyond concerning.
We'll come to the Commonwealth and what the federal government is doing in a moment, because I do want to ask you a bit more about telehealth and expanding of those Medicare subsidised sessions. But let's just stick with what the Victorian government has promised here. Do you have any issues with the mechanism that's going to be used to raise these funds, the levy through payroll tax on big business?
Well, in terms of big business, I think that as a community, there's a lot of conversation around how can we all help each other. And I think that we're in such a crisis that it's a really innovative approach that we're all banding together. And I think it is up to the community as well to look out for one another as citizens of our space.
Well, because I ask that because business mainly on the whole wants payroll tax abolished, and here we are seeing Victoria increasing it for some of the biggest companies.
Yeah, so in terms of the payroll tax, my economics background goes so far. My focus is really on mental health, and it's really innovative once again that business is being called upon to support mental health in Victoria. And, we have been really hard hit with the restrictions, and, I'm seeing clients and friends of mine, people that I know, going into facilities, and it's just really sad. And all that we want to do as a profession is help these people and increase the access.
Yeah, and what are you seeing in terms of that ongoing lasting impact from last year's extended lockdown in Melbourne?
Yeah, we're seeing some kind of emerging conditions. So people that as they were going through the lockdown, they had one set of symptoms, but now we're seeing some longer lasting impacts in terms of people really being unable to cope, and the strategies they were using to cope because they were unable to get access. It all comes down to access. Their symptoms have escalated, and now they're in psychiatric facilities, unable to get out, being medicated. Their friends are contacting them. They're not recognisable, and it's a strong concern for their family and their friends. We have people who are just in despair. They've fallen into depression again. I've had clients who I've seen 2-3 years ago, and they've been coping quite well. COVID has hit, and isolation has come with that, and their depression has spiked again. And they can't have access. And then with telehealth only being extended for 6 months, it's really concerning, and we're just not sure why we're not all on the same page. Community is expected to pull together, and psychologists in our business, but we really need government to put the money where the Royal Commissions and the Productivity Commissions are advocating, which is towards increasing the services directly to private practicing psychologists.
Okay, so let's talk about telehealth, and that comes from the federal government. That we've spoken about it before, has been such a godsend for so many people, but there are only so many psychologists, aren't there? And there's an increasing group of people who are trying to access these services. So is extending telehealth a solution?
Yes, it is a solution, because what happens is the people that couldn't get the access can now get it, and they get it in a reliable way, and they get it in a way that means that they can access their psychologist in an ongoing manner. Mental health isn't, a 5-session or a 10-session, experience. It's something that is chronic, and it's complex, and it's severe for some people. Other people have, crises and episodes in their life that they are responding to, and psychologists are the best, and they're the experts in terms of treating these complex and severe chronic mental health conditions, and also for people who have those episodic experiences in terms of, there's a grief in the family, or, there's a change in their family in other ways. So we're really calling on the government to expand the provision also and the deployment of services such as provisional psychologists. We've talked about this before. This week, we could have 125,000 more appointments being made available. We have people in despair crying that their loved ones aren't able to see clients. We have university courses being culled because the diversity within the profession is being honed in, and we really need to expand that so that we can have the richness of our profession back again, so we can continue to do the work that we want to for our Australian public. So
the capacity is there for another 125,000 appointments a week?
Yeah, absolutely. So these psychologists are at the last leg of their training, and part of that includes heavy supervision by what's called a board-approved supervisor, and they're board-approved by the regulator, APRA, and there's absolutely no reason why they can't be deployed to be seeing psychologists. They have got 4 to 5 years of training. It's high-quality training at university level, and they can be made available. We've been asking for that. We've been asking for the rebate to be increased. Now, the reason why that increase in rebate is important is because clients can't afford a professional service fee, and the rebate from the government helps the client to be able to support their contact with their psychologist. It's either that or the government's asking psychologists to take a hike in their pay.
Betty Chakouti, always good to talk the issues through with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Karina.
The Queensland Government is offering